Jacob sat in his quarters aboard the repaired Defiant and looked at the reports coming in from across the galaxy. 3 months had passed since the battle, and the effects were still spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The destruction of the Krell Armada had changed everything in ways both expected and unexpected. The first report detailed how 17 species that had been under Krell control were now free. These worlds were rebuilding and establishing their own governments. Many of them had sent messages of thanks to Earth. Some had even proposed alliances and trade agreements. Humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy, but part of a growing network of free worlds. The second report was more troubling. It described how several aggressive species had backed away from their plans to expand into human territory. This was good news, but it came with a warning. These species were now watching humanity closely and calculating whether humans were a threat or a potential ally. Every action Earth took would be scrutinized and judged. The third report made Jacob smile. It detailed how human military tactics were being studied by other species. The idea of using deception and unconventional strategies was spreading. Some species called it the human way of war. Others were more direct and simply called it cheating. Jacob did not care what they called it as long as it kept Earth safe. A knock on his door interrupted his reading, and Lisa entered carrying a data pad. She said they had received new orders from Fleet Command. Jacob asked what the orders were, and Lisa explained that the Defiant was being assigned to patrol the outer colonies. She added that several other ships would be joining them to form a new defensive fleet. Jacob nodded and said it made sense. The outer colonies had been hit hard by the Krell, and they needed protection while they rebuilt. He asked when they would depart, and Lisa said in 2 days. She hesitated and then asked if he ever regretted the decision he made in the nebula. She was referring to the choice not to accept the Krell surrender. Jacob was quiet for a moment before answering. He said he thought about it every day. He admitted that ordering the death of thousands of beings was not something he took lightly, but he stood by his decision because the alternative was to let the Krell live and potentially attack again. He said sometimes the right choice was also the hardest choice. Lisa said she understood and that she supported his decision. She added that the rest of the crew felt the same way. They knew that war was not clean or simple. It involved difficult choices and living with the consequences. Jacob thanked her and she left him alone with his thoughts. The next day, the crew gathered in the briefing room to discuss their new mission. Peter had prepared detailed charts of the outer colonies showing the areas that needed the most protection. Danny had calculated fuel and supply requirements for extended patrols. Karen had developed new tactical protocols based on what they learned fighting the Krellami reported on the diplomatic situation, and said many colonies were requesting direct meetings with the Defiant's crew. They wanted to thank the people who had saved them. Jacob approved these meetings and said they would schedule them during their patrol. He believed it was important to maintain good relations with the colonies. The briefing continued for 2 hours as they covered every aspect of their new assignment. When it was over, the crew dispersed to make their preparations. Jacob walked through the ship and observed his people at work. They moved with confidence and purpose. They knew their jobs and they did them well. He stopped by engineering, where Danny was supervising the installation of new shield generators. The engineer looked up and reported that the upgrades were ahead of schedule. He said the new shields would be 30% more effective than the old ones. Jacob asked if he had tested them, and Danny grinned and said he had run every test twice. In the weapons bay, Karen was training new crew members on the railgun systems. Jacob watched as she explained the proper firing sequences and the importance of maintaining the weapons. She emphasized that every shot had to count because in battle there might not be time for a second chance. The new crew members listened intently and took notes. On the bridge, Amy was reviewing communication protocols with her staff. She wanted to make sure they could coordinate with the other ships in their new fleet. She explained how crucial communication was in military operations. She said the battle with the Krell had been won, partly because everyone knew their role and could communicate effectively. Jacob made his way to the observation deck where several crew members were gathered looking out at Earth. They were talking quietly about their families and what they would miss while on patrol. He joined them and they fell silent. He told them to relax and asked about their families. For the next hour, he sat with them and listened to their stories. One crew member talked about his daughter who had just started school. Another mentioned her parents who ran a farm in the countryside. A third spoke about his brother who was joining the Fleet Academy. These were the people he was responsible for, and the people who had trusted him with their lives. The day of departure arrived, and the Defiant undocked from the orbital station. 4 other ships joined them to form the new patrol fleet. They were the Guardian, the Vigilant, the Resolute, and the Sentinel. Together, these 5 ships would protect the outer colonies and show the galaxy that humanity was committed to defending its territory as they left Earth orbit. Jacob stood on the bridge and watched his home planet shrink in the distance. He knew they might be gone for months or even years. He knew they would face new dangers and new challenges, but he also knew his crew was ready for whatever came next. The patrol fleet made its way to the first outer colony, which was called New Hope. The colony had been partially destroyed by the Krell and was in the process of rebuilding. As the ships approached, they could see the damage. Several habitation domes had been breached and the main power station had been destroyed. The Defiant and the other ships sent down supplies and personnel to help with reconstruction. Jacob went down to the surface with a team to meet with the colony governor. The governor was a woman named Patricia Cole who looked exhausted but determined. She thanked Jacob for coming and said the colony had lost 300 people in the Krell attack. Jacob expressed his condolences and asked what they needed most. Patricia said they needed building materials and medical supplies and protection while they rebuilt. She admitted they were afraid the Krell might return, or another hostile species might attack while they were vulnerable. Jacob assured her that the patrol fleet would remain in the area until the colony was secure. Over the next 2 weeks, the Defiant's crew worked alongside the colonists to repair the damage. Engineering teams helped restore power systems. Medical teams treated injured colonists. Security teams established defensive perimeters. It was hard work, but it felt good to be helping people rebuild their lives. One evening, Jacob was helping to repair a damaged dome when a young boy approached him. The boy said his name was Timothy and he wanted to thank the captain for saving them. Jacob knelt down to the boy's level and said they had not been able to save everyone. Timothy said quietly that the Krell had killed his parents. Jacob felt his heart break and he did not know what to say. He finally told Timothy that he was sorry. The boy said it was not Jacob's fault and that his parents would be happy knowing that Earth was safe. He added that when he grew up he wanted to join the fleet so he could protect other people the way the Defiant had protected Earth. Jacob put his hand on the boy's shoulder and told him that would make his parents very proud. Timothy smiled a little and ran off to join the other children. Jacob stood there for a long time, thinking about all the lives that had been lost and all the children who had been orphaned by the war. That night he gathered his senior officers and told them about Timothy. He said this was why they fought, not for glory or fame, but to protect people like that boy. He said every decision they made and every action they took had to be guided by the responsibility they had to the innocent. The officers nodded in agreement and returned to their duties with renewed purpose. The Defiant continued its patrol over the following months, visiting each outer colony in turn. Everywhere they went, they found people rebuilding and recovering. Some colonies had suffered worse than others, but all of them showed the same determination to survive and thrive. Jacob was impressed by the resilience of the colonists. At one colony called Far Reach, they encountered a situation that tested their diplomatic skills. 2 groups of colonists were arguing over resources and the argument was threatening to turn violent. Jacob and Lisa mediated between the groups and helped them reach a compromise. It took 3 days of negotiations, but eventually both sides agreed to share the resources fairly. At another colony called Frontier's Edge, they discovered evidence of smuggling operations. Someone was using the chaos of reconstruction to move illegal goods through the colony. Karen led a security team that tracked down the smugglers and arrested them. The colony governor was grateful and said crime had been a growing problem. Throughout their patrol, the Defiant and the other ships maintained constant vigilance. Sensors swept the surrounding space looking for any signs of hostile vessels. They ran drills weekly to keep the crew sharp. They tested their systems and maintained their weapons. Thex's remaining eyes widened in what looked like shock, and he asked what Jacob meant. He said the humans must accept their surrender. He started to say something about the laws of war, but Jacob cut him off. The captain asked about the laws of war with a cold voice that made everyone on the bridge go still. Jacob reminded the warlord that the Krell had come to human space uninvited. They had demanded surrender or death. They had bragged about conquering 47 worlds. He asked Thex to tell him how many of those worlds had been given the chance to surrender. He asked how many had been shown mercy by the mighty Krell Armada. Thex said nothing and his mandibles stopped moving. Jacob continued and said the warlord had called humans a young species playing at war. He agreed that Thex was right about one thing, which was that humanity was indeed a young species. But he said they were not playing at war. He explained that the Krell had wanted to make Earth their 48th conquest. But instead, they had taught humanity a valuable lesson. He said the aliens had taught them that the galaxy was not a safe place, that there were species out there who would take what they wanted by force. He thanked Thex for that lesson and said humanity would not forget it. The alien warlord's voice changed and became almost pleading. He said please, and that they had families and children back on their homeworld. Jacob said quietly that the 47 worlds the Krell had conquered also had families and children. He told Amy to end the transmission and the screen went dark. Lisa spoke softly and said they could accept the Krell surrender. She pointed out that they could stop the mines if the captain gave the order. Jacob turned to face his crew and saw 23 faces looking back at him. Some appeared uncertain while others looked grim. All of them were waiting for his decision about what to do with the trapped enemy fleet. This was the moment that would define who they were and what humanity stood for. Jacob began to explain his reasoning. He said if they let the Krell go, then the aliens would return. He admitted it might not be today or even this year, but they would come back eventually. He said next time the Krell would be prepared. Next time they would not underestimate humanity. Next time more humans would die in the fighting. He paused and looked at each member of his crew before continuing. He said they did not start this war. They did not ask for it, but now that they were in it, they would end it permanently. He said the choice was not easy, but it was necessary. Peter spoke up and said he was receiving a transmission from Fleet Command. He reported that Admiral Hayes wanted to speak with the captain and was asking about the situation. Jacob told Peter to inform the Admiral that the Krell Armada had been neutralized. He said to tell her that Earth was safe. He added that the USS Defiant was coming home. Over the next hour, the autonomous mines continued their work with mechanical efficiency. They moved through the nebula, finding targets and destroying them one by one. By the time the last Krell ship fell silent, only the USS Defiant remained active in the Helios Nebula. 297 Krell warships had entered the nebula in pursuit of one human vessel, and none of them left. The mines had done their job exactly as programmed. When the Defiant finally emerged from the swirling clouds, it was to find the human fleet waiting on the other side. 50 ships led by Admiral Hayes aboard the carrier Enterprise had arrived to provide support. They had come expecting to find a desperate battle, and instead found that no support was needed. The battle was over, and humanity had won. As the Defiant limped toward the fleet on damaged engines with its hull scarred and blackened, the other ships fell into formation around it. It was an honor guard for the ship that had saved Earth from conquest. On the bridge, Jacob Carter watched the fleet close around his vessel and allowed himself for the first time in hours to relax. His shoulders sagged slightly and he realized how tired he was. Amy said quietly that they were being hailed by every ship in the fleet. She reported the other captains were asking for details and asking what had happened. Jacob told her to send a message to all ships. He said to tell them that the Krell Armada came to conquer Earth. He said to tell them that humanity said no. He smiled with exhaustion and added that they should tell the fleet the galaxy just learned something very important about humanity. He said humans do not surrender, they do not break, and they never give up. The crew of the Defiant began the process of damage assessment and repairs as they made their way back to Earth. Engineering teams worked around the clock to patch hull breaches and restore damaged systems. Medical teams treated the injuries that crew members had sustained during the battle. Though remarkably, no one had been killed. Lisa compiled a report of the battle that would be studied by military academicians for years to come. She detailed how one ship had defeated an armada through a combination of tactical deception and strategic planning. Karen reviewed the weapons performance and noted that every shot had counted. Danny analyzed the engine performance and was amazed they had held. Together under such stress, Peter calculated that they had covered over 50,000 kilometers during the chase, and the Krell had fired more than 10,000 shots at them. Amy listened to the recordings of Krell communications during the battle and heard the moment when confidence had turned to confusion and then to panic. As they approached Earth, the crew could see the planet hanging in space like a blue and white jewel. It was the world they had been defending, the home of billions of people who would never know how close they had come to conquest. Jacob stood at the view screen and looked at his home and felt a deep sense of relief. The Defiant received clearance to dock at the orbital station, and as they approached, they could see crowds of people gathered at the viewing ports. News of their victory had spread quickly, and people wanted to see the ship that had defeated the Krell. As the ship settled into its docking berth, the crew began to realize that their lives had changed forever. They were no longer just another crew on another ship. They were the people who had stood against impossible odds and won. They were the crew that had sent a message to the galaxy that humanity would not be conquered. Admiral Hayes came aboard as soon as the docking procedures were complete. She walked onto the bridge and looked at the crew with an expression of pride mixed with disbelief. She asked Jacob how they had done it. He explained the plan step by step from the fake system failure to the minefield trap. The Admiral listened and shook her head in amazement. She said it was the most audacious military operation she had ever heard of. She told them that the destruction of the Krell Armada had sent shockwaves through the entire galaxy. Dozens of species that had been conquered by the Krell were celebrating their freedom. Other species that had been considering attacks on humanity were reconsidering their plans. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a single day. Jacob asked about casualties, and the Admiral's expression became somber. She said the Krell had attacked 3 outer colonies before reaching Earth. Those colonies had been destroyed and thousands of people had died. She said the Defiant's victory had prevented the same thing from happening to Earth, but it had come at a terrible cost for those colonies. The crew fell silent as they absorbed this news. They had won the battle, but people had still died. Karen asked if there had been any survivors from the colonies. The Admiral said rescue ships were searching the debris, but so far they had found very few. She added that the death toll was still being calculated. Lisa asked what would happen now. And the Admiral said that humanity was preparing for the possibility of more attacks. The Krell had been one threat, but there were others out there. Earth's defenses were being strengthened and the fleet was being expanded. Humanity had been caught unprepared this time, but it would not happen again. She told Jacob that he and his crew were being awarded the highest honors that Earth could give. She said they would be remembered as the people who saved their world. Jacob replied that they were just doing their duty. The Admiral smiled and said that sometimes doing your duty meant becoming a legend. Over the following weeks, the crew of the Defiant gave countless interviews and attended numerous ceremonies. They were uncomfortable with all the attention, but understood it was necessary. People needed heroes, and they needed to believe that humanity could defend itself. The story of the battle spread across Earth and then across human colonies. Children learned about it in schools. Military officers studied it in academies. Politicians debated its implications in government chambers. The Defiant itself was repaired and refitted with improved systems. It would fly again, and its crew would continue to serve, but they would never forget the day they faced the Krell Armada. Peter explained that 60-plus Krell ships had formed a wall directly ahead of them, and they were overlapping their shields to create a solid barrier. He said the Defiant would never punch through a defensive formation that strong. Jacob studied the tactical display and saw that Peter was right. The Krell had created a shield wall 3 layers deep, with each ship positioned to cover the others. It was a textbook defensive formation that would take sustained fire from multiple ships to break through. Jacob asked if they could go around the formation, and Lisa replied negative. She said the Krell had extended the formation on both flanks, and going around would add at least 10 minutes to their approach time. She added that they would be torn apart long before they reached the nebula if they tried to go the long way. Jacob said simply that they would go through instead. Every head on the bridge turned to look at the captain with expressions of disbelief. Lisa said carefully that they could not break through that shield wall because their weapons were not powerful enough. Jacob said they were not going to break through it. He explained they were going to go under it instead. He told Peter to adjust their approach vector and take them down relative to the Krell formation, then angle up to pass beneath the shield wall. Peter said the Krell would adjust their formation to compensate. He explained that the moment the Defiant changed course, the enemy would shift to block them again. Jacob agreed, but said not if the aliens were too busy shooting at the wrong target. He asked Amy if they still had control of those boarding pods that the Krell had launched earlier. Amy checked her console and confirmed that yes, the pods were still drifting in space behind them and their control systems were still active. Jacob told her to take remote control of those pods and program them to mimic the Defiant's engine signature and power output. He said to launch them on their current heading straight toward the Krell shield wall. A slow smile spread across Amy's face as she understood the plan. She said he wanted to use them as decoys. Jacob confirmed this and explained that the Krell were expecting the humans to charge straight at their shield wall. He said they would give the enemy exactly what they expected, just not where they expected it. He told Amy to launch those pods at full speed directly toward the center of the formation and make it look like a desperate ramming attempt. Amy said she was on it, and her fingers flew across her controls. She reported the pods were under their control, and she was programming the engine signatures. She said they were ready to launch on his mark. Jacob watched the tactical display as the distance to the Krell shield wall continued to shrink. 3 minutes remained until they reached the nebula, and 3 minutes to survive the gauntlet of enemy fire. Jacob gave the order to launch the pods and told Peter that the moment those pods were away to take them down and under at maximum burn. The 12 Krell boarding pods shot forward from behind the Defiant, and their engines flared brightly as they accelerated toward the shield wall. On every Krell sensor, they would appear to be the human ship making a last desperate charge. The instant the pods launched, Peter threw the Defiant into a steep dive. The ship groaned under the stress as he pushed the inertial dampeners to their limits. On the view screen, the Krell shield wall seemed to rise up above them as they dropped beneath its firing line. Lisa said it was working and the Krell were concentrating fire on the pods. She reported they thought the humans were trying to ram them. Dozens of Krell warships opened fire on the approaching boarding pods, which were destroyed in seconds under the concentrated barrage. But those few seconds were all the Defiant needed to slip beneath the enemy formation. Peter announced they were beneath the shield wall and adjusting course now to come up on the other side. The Defiant angled upward and passed through the gap between the Krell formation and the space below it. For a moment they were in the blind spot of every ship in the shield wall where they were untouchable and unseen by the enemy sensors. Then they emerged on the other side, and the entrance to the Helios Nebula lay directly ahead, with no obstacles between them and safety. Peter said 2 minutes to Nebula, and no ships between them and the entrance. He reported they were clear of the immediate threat. Lisa said shields were at 40%, and multiple systems were damaged, but all critical systems were still functional. Jacob allowed himself to breathe and said well done to everyone. Then he added that now came the hard part. Danny looked up from his engineering console with an expression of disbelief and asked what the captain meant by the hard part. He asked what Jacob would call what they had just done. Jacob replied that the previous part was the easy part. He explained they had survived the approach, but now they had to make sure the Krell did not survive. He asked Amy for the status on the mines. Amy reported the beacon was still transmitting and the mines were acknowledging their signal. She said they were receiving the targeting data that the Defiant was feeding them. Jacob said good, because in about 2 minutes, they were going to have nearly 300 very angry Krell warships following them into that nebula. He added that when that happened, they would show the aliens what happened when you underestimated humanity. The USS Defiant plunged into the Helios Nebula like a diver entering deep water. Immediately, the view screen filled with swirling clouds of ionized gas that glowed in shades of purple and blue and green. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the sensors struggled to penetrate the charged particles. Peter announced they were inside the nebula and sensors were almost useless. He said he could barely see 50 meters ahead. Jacob said perfect, because that meant the Krell could not see either. He asked Amy if the mines were still receiving their signal, and she confirmed that all 17,000 mines were online and awaiting targets. She said the moment the Krell ships entered the nebula, the trap would be sprung. The ship shook as the first Krell vessels emerged from the swirling clouds behind them, with weapons blazing despite their limited visibility. Lisa reported they were being followed, and she counted 40 ships so far, with more entering every second. She said the Krell were spreading out and trying to surround them in the nebula. Jacob told her to let them spread out. He explained that the more dispersed they were, the better this would work. He ordered Amy to activate the mines and set them to full autonomous mode so they could choose their own targets. Amy entered the command sequence and then looked up with a grim expression on her face. She reported the mines were active and moving into attack positions. For a moment, nothing happened, and the Defiant continued its course through the nebula, with the Krell ships in pursuit. On the bridge, the crew waited in tense silence and wondered if the plan would work. Then the nebula came alive with explosions and fire. The first Krell ship to fall victim to the mines never saw what hit it. One moment it was pursuing the Defiant through the swirling gases, and the next moment 3 autonomous mines attached themselves to its hull and detonated simultaneously. The ship broke apart and added its wreckage to the clouds around it. Karen said quietly that was the first kill. And then she updated her count. She said second kill and third kill and fourth kill as more explosions lit up the nebula. All around them, the invisible mines were finding their targets with deadly precision. Each mine carried enough explosive power to crack a Krell. Hull and they had been programmed with one simple directive, which was to destroy any ship that was not the USS Defiant. Lisa spoke with awe in her voice and said she was reading massive explosions throughout the nebula. She reported the Krell were firing blindly, trying to hit the mines, but they could not see them. She added that the aliens could not see anything in the charged particle clouds. On the communications channel, Amy could hear the Krell transmissions descending into chaos and panic. She listened as orders were being shouted and contradicted and shouted again. Ships were calling for assistance and reporting mine strikes and screaming as they died in the darkness. Amy reported that Warlord Thex was ordering a retreat. She said he was telling his ships to fall back and exit the nebula immediately. Jacob asked if they could stop the aliens from leaving. Karen replied that she was already on it. She explained she had programmed the mines near the nebula's edge to form a perimeter. She said any Krell ship that tried to exit would run right into the waiting mines. Jacob nodded and told her to do it. More explosions lit up the nebula as Krell ships attempted to flee, only to run into the mines at the edge. Some tried to force their way through with shields at maximum power, but the mines swarmed them in dozens. No shield could withstand that kind of concentrated firepower, and the ships broke apart one after another. Peter said quietly that he was not reading any more Krell ships entering the nebula. He thought they had stopped the pursuit outside. Jacob asked how many had made it inside before they stopped, and Lisa checked her tactical display. She said 237 ships had entered the nebula before the Krell realized it was a trap. She gave the current count of active Krell vessels as 112 and dropping fast. Jacob asked about the mine count. Lisa said they still had over 14,000 mines active, which was more than enough to finish the job. Jacob stood from his command chair and walked to the view screen. He stared out at the swirling gases that hid so much destruction and death. The bridge exploded with light and sound as every system on the USS Defiant surged back to life at once. The main reactor went from cold shutdown to full power in less than 90 seconds and flooded the ship with energy. Lisa shouted that shields were up and weapons were hot. She said they had full power across all systems, and her voice carried excitement mixed with relief. Karen Miller did not wait for orders because she knew exactly what to do. The moment her targeting computer locked onto the 3 Krell warships, she opened fire. The Defiant's main railguns had been designed specifically to punch through Krell armor, and now they fired in rapid succession. Each tungsten carbide round moved at a significant fraction of light speed and crossed the distance to the targets in less than a second. The first Krell ship never had time to react or raise shields or even understand what was happening. The rounds punched through its ridged armor like it was paper and detonated deep inside the vessel's core. The ship broke apart in an expanding sphere of debris and atmosphere and frozen gases. Karen reported the first target destroyed and said she was already engaging the second target. Her fingers moved over her controls with practiced precision. The second Krell ship had managed to raise its shields, but it was too little and far too late. The Defiant's missiles, which had been launched in the same volley as the railgun rounds, overwhelmed the shields through sheer numbers. 40 missiles struck the target and found weak points in the armor. The second warship vanished in a brilliant flash of light that briefly illuminated the darkness of space. Lisa said 2 ships were down, and disbelief was evident in her voice. She started to ask how they had done it, but Peter interrupted from navigation and said the third ship was trying to run. He reported the enemy vessel was turning away with engines at full power, trying to escape back to the safety of the Armada. Jacob said Karen's name calmly, and she replied that she was on it. The third Krell warship had made it almost 500 meters before Karen's targeting solution finished calculating. A single railgun round caught the ship in its engine section where the reactor was located. The vessel did not explode in a dramatic fashion. Instead, its reactor containment failed, and the ship simply ceased to exist as it was consumed by its own power source in a fraction of a second. Karen reported that all 3 targets were eliminated and said the total time from power up to final kill was 11 seconds. The bridge was silent for a moment as the crew processed what had just happened. They had been facing certain death just moments ago, and now 3 enemy warships were nothing but expanding clouds of debris. Around them, the Krell boarding pods that had been launched were now adrift with their motherships destroyed and their occupants stranded in space. Jacob told Amy to send the message now, and she opened a channel to the Krell flagship. Jacob spoke clearly and said Warlord Thex had given them 2 options, which were surrender or die. He said the humans had chosen option 3 and invited the Warlord to come and get them. On the main screen, the Krell Armada was no longer holding position. Ships were moving and formations were shifting, and even at this distance Jacob could sense their confusion and growing anger. Lisa spoke urgently and said the entire Armada was advancing. All 297 remaining ships were moving forward and charging weapons. Jacob said good and gave Peter a new course. He wanted full speed toward the Helios Nebula. He told Danny he needed everything the engines could give them. Peter turned in his chair with surprise and asked if the captain really meant the nebula. Jacob confirmed that he did mean the nebula, and Peter pointed out that would take them directly through the center of the Krell formation. He said they would be surrounded and caught in crossfire from every direction. Jacob agreed and said he knew that. Peter said the aliens would trap them, and Lisa added that no ship could survive concentrated fire from nearly 300 warships. Jacob explained they did not have to survive all 300 ships. They just had to survive long enough to reach the nebula. He said the charged particles in there would scatter the Krell targeting sensors, and the enemy would be firing blind. Karen pointed out that the humans would also be blind. Jacob smiled and said no, they would not be. He told Amy to activate the secure beacon and send the signal. Amy's fingers moved over her console, and then she looked up, confused. She said the beacon was asking for an authorization code that she did not have. Jacob spoke clearly and gave her a long code with letters and numbers. Amy entered the code and her eyes went wide. She said the beacon was transmitting but asked what it was sending. Jacob said it was sending coordinates and a very specific set of instructions. He explained that these instructions had been uploaded into the nebula 3 weeks ago, before the Krell ever arrived in this system. Understanding began to dawn on Lisa's face, and she said the supply convoy that was supposed to be delayed. She realized Jacob had sent them into the nebula. Jacob corrected her and said it was not a supply convoy but a minefield. He revealed that 17,000 autonomous mines were sitting quietly in the nebula, waiting for the signal to activate and waiting to be told where to find their targets. Danny let out a low whistle and said that was why Jacob wanted the Krell to chase them. They were going to lead the entire Armada right into the trap. Jacob confirmed this was exactly the plan and asked Peter for time to nebula. Peter checked his calculations and said 6 minutes at current speed, but he added that the Krell would get in weapons range long before that, and they would tear the Defiant apart. Jacob told them they better be ready. He ordered Karen to switch to point defense and shoot down everything the enemy threw at them. He told Danny to rotate shield harmonics so the Krell could not find a weak frequency. He told Lisa to have damage control teams on standby. The crew responded with "Yes, Captain," and moved to execute his orders. On the view screen, the Krell Armada was spreading out and forming a massive net designed to catch one small human ship. Nearly 300 warships were converging on the Defiant from all directions. Jacob watched them come and allowed himself a small smile. The Krell had conquered 47 worlds and studied countless species and learned countless tactics. But they had made one critical mistake in their planning. They had assumed that humans would fight like everyone else they had encountered. They had assumed humans would follow the traditional rules of warfare. The aliens were about to learn that humans did not believe in fair fights. Humans believed in winning by any means necessary. They believed in using every advantage and every trick and every bit of cunning they possessed. The first Krell weapons fire began to reach them, and the USS Defiant plunged forward into the storm of incoming fire. The ship shook violently as plasma bolts struck the shields. Warning alarms wailed throughout the bridge and damage reports started coming in from all sections. Lisa called out that shields were at 85%, and the forward section was taking the heaviest hits. She said they had microfractures forming in the hull plating on decks 3 and 4. Jacob gripped the arms of his command chair as another volley rocked the ship and asked Danny how the engines were holding up. Danny replied they were running at 112% capacity. He said he could keep this up for maybe 10 more minutes, but after that they risked a core breach. Jacob reminded him they only needed 6 minutes. Peter gave the time to nebula as 5 minutes 30 seconds, but added that at least 40 Krell ships had moved to intercept their course. He said those ships would reach the nebula entrance before the Defiant did, and would block their path. Jacob told Karen to clear them a path, and she said she was already on it. She launched a spread of long-range missiles programmed to seek out the nearest Krell vessels. The missiles streaked away toward the blocking force, and Karen said impact in 20 seconds. The Krell ships opened fire with their point defense systems and destroyed many of the missiles before they could reach their targets, but not all of them got through. 3 Krell warships vanished in brilliant explosions as the surviving missiles overwhelmed their defenses, and the Path ahead cleared momentarily, but more ships were already moving to fill the gap because the Krell had numbers on their side and they were using those numbers to their advantage. Lisa reported shields at 60% and said they had plasma burns on the starboard hull. Engineering teams were deploying emergency patches to keep the damaged section sealed. Amy turned from communications with a pale face and said, "The Krell were broadcasting on all channels." She reported that Warlord Thex was ordering his ships to disable the Defiance engines because he wanted the humans taken alive. Jacob raised an eyebrow and said now they had made the Warlord curious. He added that this was a mistake on the aliens' part because curiosity would make them hesitate, and hesitation was something the humans could use to their advantage. Another violent shake ran through the ship and the lights flickered before emergency power kicked in. Danny shouted that they had taken a direct hit to the port engine nacelle. He said there was a coolant leak and if it reached the plasma injectors they would have a catastrophic explosion. Jacob ordered him to seal it off and vent the entire section if necessary. Danny said yes sir and began venting procedures. The ship lurched as he released the entire port nacelle into space along with the leaking coolant. The bridge of the USS Defiant was quiet except for the soft hum of the computers and the occasional beep from the control panels. Captain Jacob Carter stood in front of the main screen and looked at the sight before him. 300 alien warships filled the darkness of space like a swarm of angry metal insects. Each ship was massive and covered with weapons that could tear planets apart. The Krell Armada had arrived at Earth's doorstep, and they wanted only one thing, which was complete surrender. Lieutenant Amy Brooks sat at her station and her fingers moved over the communications console. She looked up at the captain with worried eyes and said the aliens were calling again. Jacob nodded and told her to put them through. The screen changed and showed the face of Warlord Thex, who was the commander of the Krell forces. The alien had 4 eyes that gleamed with what looked like amusement and his mouth parts clicked together in a way that sounded like laughter. The alien's voice came through the speakers deep and rumbling. He told the human ship that they had 30 minutes to surrender. He said their single ship against his armada was not bravery but pure foolishness. Behind Jacob, the tactical officer Commander Lisa Grant tensed at her station and reported that all 300 enemy ships were charging their weapons. Jacob kept his eyes on the alien commander and asked if Thex had learned anything about human history. The alien's mouth clicked faster and he said, human history meant nothing. He told Jacob that humans were a young species playing at war, while the Krell had conquered 47 worlds already. He said Earth would be world number 48. Jacob spoke quietly and said then their intelligence had failed them badly. He told Amy to cut the transmission, and the screen went dark. Lisa looked up from her station with confusion on her face and asked what the captain's orders were. Jacob turned to face his crew and saw 23 men and women who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never see home again. Navigator Peter Hayes sat at his console with his jaw tight. Engineer Danny Cooper waited by the engine display with nervous fingers. Weapons Officer Karen Miller had her hand ready over her controls. Jacob told them they would do what humans did best, which was improvise. He asked Danny how long they could run on emergency power alone. Danny thought for a moment and said maybe 6 hours if they kept life support at minimum levels. Jacob told Lisa to shut down everything and make it look like a complete system failure. Understanding showed on Lisa's face and she said he wanted the aliens to think they were dead in space. Jacob agreed and explained that the Krell would come to investigate and claim their prize. That was when the Defiant would show them what one human ship could really do. Amy spoke up with an uncertain voice and pointed out that the plan required them to drift without shields or weapons or life support. She added that if the aliens decided to just destroy them instead of boarding, then it was over. Jacob said simply that they would die trying, but they would not surrender, not to these aliens and not to anyone because that was not who humans were. Peter turned from his console and reminded the captain that their fleet would not arrive for another 8 hours. He said even if they survived this fight, they would be alone out here for a long time. Jacob replied that they better make these 30 minutes count. He told everyone to take their positions and ordered Danny to start the shutdown sequence. He wanted it to look good and catastrophic. He told Lisa to have every weapon ready on standby so they could fire the moment systems came back online. The crew responded with a chorus of "Yes, sir," and moved to follow his orders. The lights began to dim on the bridge as the shutdown started. The familiar hum of the engines died away until there was only silence. Jacob sat back in his command chair and watched the Krell Armada on the screen. They were still out there with weapons charged and waiting for the humans to make their choice. The Krell had conquered 47 worlds and they had never faced humans before. Jacob knew something the aliens did not know. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other and learning every trick of war that existed. They had fought in trenches and jungles and deserts and cities. They had learned to win when victory seemed impossible. They had learned to survive when survival seemed hopeless. And most importantly, they had learned that the best weapon was not always the biggest gun, but the willingness to do whatever it took to protect what mattered. The Defiant drifted in the darkness now, running lights gone and engines cold. To the Krell, it would look like a ship that had suffered a catastrophic failure. They would see a helpless vessel crewed by a species that could not even keep their systems running. They would laugh at the humans and their pathetic attempt to stand against the mighty Armada, and that laughter would be their first mistake. Jacob checked his watch and saw that 5 minutes had passed since they went dark. Through the screen, which was now running on minimal power, he could see the Krell Armada holding their position. They were waiting and watching. He knew what they were thinking because he had read the intelligence reports. The Krell believed in strength and power. They believed that the biggest force always won. They had conquered world after world using this simple philosophy. But humans had learned long ago that size did not always matter. A small force with the right plan could defeat a much larger enemy. It had happened throughout human history, from ancient battles to modern warfare. The key was to make the enemy overconfident, to make them think they had already won, and then to strike when they least expected it. Amy whispered from her station even though there was no need to be quiet in space. She said 3 ships were breaking away from the main formation and approaching. Jacob told her to let them come. He tapped the armrest of his chair, which was a nervous habit he had never been able to break. The 3 Krell ships grew larger on the screen as they moved closer. Each one was 3 times the size of the Defiant, and covered in thick, ridged armor. Danny reported from engineering that the reactor was completely cold, but he could bring it back to full power in 90 seconds. Karen said her targeting solutions were ready, and the moment they had power, she could fire. Jacob leaned forward and watched as the 3 enemy ships came closer and closer. This was the critical moment. If the Krell decided to just destroy them from a distance, then the plan would fail and they would all die. Everything depended on the aliens being arrogant enough to want to capture a human vessel intact. Jacob was counting on their desire to study human technology and interrogate human prisoners. He was betting his life and the lives of his crew that the Krell would send boarding parties instead of missiles. Lisa reported that the ships were at 2,000 meters and closing slowly. She said they were scanning the Defiant, trying to determine if this was a trap. Jacob felt his heart beat faster as the distance closed. 1,500 meters, 1,000 meters, 700 meters. Then Lisa said the aliens were launching boarding pods. Jacob asked how many, and she said 12 pods carrying full assault teams. He smiled in the darkness and said, "Perfect." He told them to wait until the pods were committed and could not turn back. The boarding pods moved through space toward the dead human ship, and behind them the 3 Krell warships waited confident in their victory. Jacob took a deep breath and gave the order. He said now, and the USS Defiant came roaring back to life.